Hi everyone, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Welcome back to my vegetable garden. Boy, today is an exciting day. We're finally in the middle of April and it's time to plant some cool season crops. Now if you're new to my videos, welcome. I live in Spokane, Washington in USDA Hardiness Zone 5B. I've got all kinds of seeds to plant, so let's get down to business. Now just to give you an idea of where I'm going to be planting this morning, this is a layout of this year's garden, and you can see we have all sorts of raised beds, which I absolutely love. But in the westernmost row, it gets a little bit of late afternoon shade, and so I typically tend to plant cool season crops in here because they're a little more forgiving of not having tons of sunlight. And so I have all kinds of things to plant, as you can see. Now what about soil prep? Last fall and earlier this spring, I put about an inch layer of compost over the tops of all of the raised beds. And the nice thing is the nutrients will filter down into the soil all by themselves, so I don't have to expend the energy to turn it over. But there's also another reason that I don't want to turn over the soil, and that's because it damages the layers in the soil and the soil structure. And it's so important to keep that intact. So I try to do a minimal amount of disturbance of the soil. What my usual routine is, and I did this last week just as a time saver, is I'll take a spading fork, you could use a shovel, and I just put it down into the soil, and then I kind of wiggle it a little bit, I pull it up, push it in again, wiggle it a little bit, and that's all I'm doing. The main reason I'm doing this is to kind of prepare a little bit of a seed bed, since that's mainly what I'm going to be planting today. And I would do the same thing if I'm going to plant some seedlings. The first thing I'm going to plant is Karmazin fava beans. And look at the beautiful seeds. Now, if you have never grown fava beans, you are in for a treat. First of all, the plants are absolutely gorgeous, and they have the most unusual flowers that are black and white, so very striking. But most of all, the taste of a fava bean is wonderful. I had some in a pasta dish at a restaurant a few months ago, and I thought, oh yeah, I have got to grow fava beans this year. Now the seeds go in 1 inch deep and 6 inches apart. Now because I only have 28 seeds, I laid out where they're going to be planted ahead of time because I want to use the other part of the bed to grow some sunflowers and zinnias to bring in pollinators. And I'm using a tool that's called a dibble or dibber, and it's roughly about 6 inches long. And since these need to be spaced about 6 inches apart, that worked out perfectly. And what I'm going to do, because I always like to orient seeds so that they get the best possible germination, is there's an opening in one end, and that's where the root and the sprout are going to come out from, and I'm going to point that down. You'll notice that I already have the drip system on top of the bed so that that's ready to go, and also I'm planting the seeds pretty close to it so that I'm certain they get enough water. Always remember to label your plantings, by the way, because it can be easy to forget where you put things. In this bed, I'm going to plant seeds for rutabagas and kohlrabi. I had 2 varieties recommended to me. For the rutabagas, it was Joan, and I've heard really good things about her, so I wanted to give her a try. And then kohlrabi is super schmeltz. My sister grew them last year. They are absolutely enormous, but they don't get woody, and so I thought I definitely want to give them a try. Now when you need to plant seeds, aside from ones that needed to be spaced like I just did with the fava beans, it's easiest to just take the tip of an iron rake or a hoe or a shovel and just use it to make a furrow. My biggest challenge is doing anything in a straight line. Because I think that the kohlrabi is going to be really tall, I'm putting them in the middle of the bed. I think that's going to work out best. They get planted 1/4 inch deep, and I'll thin them later to a better spacing. But the important thing you need to know about both rutabagas and kohlrabi is that they're members of the cabbage family, and they can get a lot of insect pests. So I'm going to cover this bed as soon as I water everything in with some floating row cover, and I will leave it in place for the entire season because kohlrabi and rutabagas do not need to be pollinated. And that floating row cover will act as a barrier to keep the insects away from the plants. Once the seeds are planted, I just fill in the furrow and pat it down so that they make good contact with the soil. And again, I'm going to water everything in because that's so important. And you can probably tell our soil is super dry, and that's because we've had a very dry spring. In this bed, I'm going to grow 3 rows of carrots and 1 of parsnips. Now for carrots, I'm going to grow 2 rows of my old standby, which is scarlet nantes. This is a great carrot and it stores well over the winter. And then I'm also growing a row of mokum carrots, and that is a great variety. For the parsnips, I'm going to grow Hal Blanche. I've grown it before, and these are also ones that keep really well over the winter months. Now, once this bed has been planted and watered, I'm going to give it a special treatment to help with germination. So I'll show you that in a moment. I realize it's hard to see what I'm doing because these seeds are basically the color of the soil, but trust me, I am planting them. The important thing with carrots is that you thin them out later because they really need room for their roots to grow. So once the seedlings are about 3 inches tall, I'll space them 3 to 4 inches apart. Well, at least you can see what the parsnip seeds look like. They're pretty interesting, aren't they? Now, some folks like to soak them in water the day before they plant them to get better germination. I have tried that in the past, and I've found it doesn't make that big of a difference for me. So I'm just planting them today dry right out of the packet. Now, parsnips are another root crop that you absolutely must thin if you want decent roots. So thin them just like I mentioned for the carrots. Now, I mentioned that the carrots and the parsnips get some kind of a special treatment, and you're looking at it. It's pretty ugly, right? So the problem with carrots and parsnips is that they're very slow to germinate, and also their little seedlings are these wimpy little things that really have trouble pushing up through the soil. And usually what happens in the spring is you'll have a lovely sunny day like this, and so the soil dries out a little bit. Then maybe you have a rainstorm, and so it's wet, and then it's dry, and then it's wet, and what happens is a crust forms on the soil surface. And so by putting boards down right after you have planted the seeds and watered them in, and leaving the boards in place for about a week and a half, it prevents that crust from forming on the soil surface. Then you remove the boards after about a week and a half, and the seedlings will start germinating earlier than usual and better than usual. So I really like this method. I call it the board method. And yeah, it doesn't look so great right now, but it works great. This bed is going to get beets and Swiss chard. For beets, I'm growing cylindra. Sometimes it's called cylindrical, and I absolutely love this one. They have oblong roots, they store well, and they're just delicious. And then the Swiss chard is rainbow blend. A similar variety is bright lights. They are just gorgeous because they have all different color stalks. I'm crazy about Swiss chard because it lasts a lot longer in the heat of the summer than spinach does. Spinach does not like hot temperatures at all, but the Swiss chard just keeps plugging along. Now, Swiss chard and beets are both members of the beet family, and because of this, they are susceptible to leaf miners. The adult is a fly that lays eggs on the leaves. The eggs hatch, they tunnel down into the leaves, and they basically ruin your stand of spinach, Swiss chard, or beets in nothing flat. It's a very annoying insect. So this bed is also going to get covered with floating row cover, just like I did for cabbage family members. So first I got to get the seeds in. The first thing I wanted to do is show you the beet seeds before I plant them because they're really quite unusual, and it's the same for Swiss chard seeds. They are actually little clusters of seeds, and I'm very happy to tell you, you do not need to separate them. So you just plant them in a furrow, and then of course, because the beets are a root crop, you want to thin them out once they've reached about 3 inches in height. And that way they have plenty of room to develop a nice root. Now some of you will recall that I used the winter sowing method to plant some seeds outdoors in the dead of winter, and this method has worked really well for me. So it involves planting seeds in milk jugs or some other type of a container and just leaving them out in the elements. And what happens is that they germinate at the right time. They harden off, which means they acclimate to both the temperatures outside and the intensity of the sunlight, and they are ready to go when I'm ready to plant them in the garden. So I've got these nice little onion seedlings here. The variety is Talon, and I'm going to go ahead and empty out this jug, tease them apart very carefully, and plant them in this last bed. Well, that was a little bit scary to do, but I got them all out without anybody being worse for wear. And so I'm just gently pulling them apart. Look at this great little seedling here. Amazing. So I'm just going to make a little hole, make sure the roots get in there, and then just put the soil around them. And I'm planting them at the same depth that they were in the container. You don't want to plant them too deeply because what will happen is the soil will get in between where these leaves develop, and that can cause some rotting, so you don't want that. This is really exciting. I'm definitely going to water them in well as soon as I get them all planted. Can't get over some of these roots. They're amazing. I finally get to water everything in. I ended up with 3 rows of those little onion seedlings, and now that I've watered them in, you can better see them. They are going to do great, and I'm very excited about it, and it's good to know that that winter sowing method works. Now I have covered this bed with netting. Probably I'll keep it in place for about 2 or 3 weeks, and that's because we have a lot of quail in the garden. And what happens is they love to pull things like new onions out of the ground. It's really annoying. So the bird netting works great. I just have it up on some hoops, and the plants will get plenty of sunlight, moisture if it rains, and so on, and I can keep an eye on them. So just a little protection for them. As you can see, I got the floating row cover onto 3 of the beds that I just planted. And they are on top of hoops that we made from just some old drip tubing that we had on hand, and they slip down into those white cylinders of PVC. And I've weighted them down on either end so that the wind won't blow them off. Now for this bed, which is where the fava beans were planted, I have it on top because I want to give them a little bit of frost protection just in case. And for the other 2 beds, those are for insect protection. And so that bed has the kohlrabi and the rutabagas, and the bed down there has Swiss chard and beets. So for these guys, they're cabbage family crops. They need protection from 3 different things actually: root maggots, aphids, and cabbage worms. And the bed with the beets and Swiss chard needs protection from leaf miners. So this is a lightweight fabric. It's very easy to find in large garden centers and online if you just look for floating row cover. And again, it acts as a physical barrier against the insects, and it also gives plants a few degrees of frost protection. Now it lets in sunlight, And also if it were to rain, it will go through this fabric just fine, so the plants will still get moisture. I am so excited that I finally got to plant something out in the garden. And you are probably excited about planting your garden too. Remember, you can ask me if you have questions. My email is susan@susansinthegarden.com. I hope this video was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and I'll see you next week.